I'm sure that this is going to resonate with people, this
Mm.
conversation. Do you have suggestions for people who might be feeling that kind of like, I know what you mean when you do something that you're like, your soul doesn't agree with. And it's like, I call it, I think what I get is some sort of existential horror. And
Oh, yeah.
it's just like everywhere. And it's like you're going in the wrong direction of reality or something. So if people are stuck in that and are scared, how do those people try and stop and switch to going in the right direction? Hopefully that made some semblance of sense.
Right, right. And you know what, Michaela, I wish there was you can imagine that I get asked that question
Yeah.
hundreds of times a day. And I think we want a simple answer, don't we? We want just one answer that I don't think there's one answer. Um,
Part of it is to
mm,
to try to listen to what you say, to what you're saying, and see if it makes you feel stronger or weaker.
yeah,
Like each word is like a stepping stone through a swamp,
right.
you know, and if it's the right word, then you step on it and it feels secure and stable compared to the territory around it, and you test that out, and then you dare to see if that's the way you think, as opposed to that
Yeah.
persona that you're putting on for public adulation and protection,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the temptation of the actor. So
Yes.
in the movie Pinocchio, when Pinocchio is trying to stop lying and to become a real boy, he faces two major temptations apart from lying. One is to be a victim, and the other is to be an actor. It
Mm,
took me a long time to figure out why being an actor was a temptation, but you put your finger on it with your description. It's to adopt a set of roles that will, well, appeal to narcissistic inflation, something like that.
right.
And there's a terrible totalitarian danger in that. It's terrible. So,
Yes. Yes.
and that's my suspicions are that's what you were reacting to so viscerally, that you were participating in that, and you had your reasons. But you mentioned something that I think maybe the three of us could discuss that would be interesting. You know, this idea about all white people being racist. So,
Mm,
so I kind of wondered about that as a psychologist, but more broadly, because maybe you could say, well, are all people racist? And here's what I mean by that. Well, we all have an in-group preference. Now, what that group might be, you know, it might be you and the person you love, it might be you and your family, it might be you and your town, it might be you and your state or your country, it might be you and your race. You know, that who that in-group is can vary, but
mm,
we do have preferences for people, and we do have in-group preferences, and the corollary of that is that we have out-group skepticism and maybe fear and maybe disgust and all of that. And from what I've been able to understand anthropologically, that's more or less a human universal. You know,
mm-hmm.
as different peoples have been brought around the world into global community, let's say, one of the things that anthropologists have found is that it's almost always the case that any given tribe of people will use the word that refers to human beings to their tribe and some other word to everyone else.
Uh-huh.
And
Mm,
so it's possible that that's a deep tendency that we all have to fight against. And I mean, there's part of the reason these ideas are so compelling to people and able to possess them, the wokeness ideas, let's say, to use a
mm,
casual category, is that, you know, they contain an element of truth. You know, people have an in-group preference that can easily be distorted into something that's quite akin to racism. I mean, you even see that in chimpanzees, for example. They'll go on raiding forays into neighboring territories, and if they outnumber, the males do this, if they outnumber the foreigners that they come across, they will tear them to pieces. So it's, that was a stunning discovery.
Lovely.
That primatologists made. Jane Goodall's team discovered that in the 70s. It was a real shock.
Wow.
Right. So
They were trying to find all the nice chimps.
yeah, well,
And it was like, oh, they just rip each other to shreds. Whoa, okay.
yeah, exactly. Well, no one had any inkling previous to that human tendency for war, broadly speaking, was so deep that it was even shared by our, closest animal relative. So this is very deep. So, the idea that racism and in-group preference, all of that, is something that human beings struggle with is true. And then you say, well, you twist that a bit. You say, well, that's particularly true of white people because they hold the power. It's like, well, it's an interesting proposition. But the question is, well, if it's true, exactly how is it true, and what's its limits, and how does that play out in the case of other races or groups, Asians, for example,
Right.
And what are the dangers of putting the idea that way, and what makes you so sure that that's also not true of your group, and how does power play into that? Like, these are all genuine questions that we should be asking
Right.
ourselves, instead of like hammering home the idea that we have the answer to this. It's like, well, you said, you got elevated as a black woman in this. Well, it's very difficult to not see that as an exacerbation of your in-group preference, and then an exaggeration of that implicit or explicit racism on your part. And I think that's part of what you were rebelling against.
Yes. And you know what? The questions that you were just asking before, those are the exact questions that I had. Just simple questions. And it started to signal again that something wasn't right here, that I couldn't even just ask the simplest questions, or at least felt that I couldn't. I could have, but I was much more scared of the consequences of asking the questions than leading with the curiosity of getting some kind of answer, right? And in my letter, Mikhaila, you read this part out earlier about the disempowerment of Black people. That's how I started to feel extremely disempowered. Even when people would say things like, yeah, it's because white people have all the power. According to who? And in what context are we talking about? Does it matter where in the world you are? Which ones? Right?
I had an experience like that. It not exactly like that. It was like that, but for me. And I was taking sciences because I'd switched out of humanities because there was a lot of, I was taking a course on Homer, and it was Homer through the feminist lens. And I was like, that's not what I paid you guys for. So I switched into sciences, and about every couple of months, somebody would come in and they'd say, okay, for all the women in the room, I know you've had a much harder time getting to where you are than the men have. And I was just like, are you telling me I'm stupid? Like, what exactly are you saying here? And how dare you suggest that it was like insulting in kind of a condescending way, which was the complete opposite of whatever they were. Well, maybe it wasn't the opposite of what they were trying to do. But yeah, it's condescending and irritating.
Yeah, well, it
bugged me.
Well, think about what that does in some sense. It makes your generic femininity and your generic vulnerability far more important than your individual particularity. And this is what I've been objecting to with regards to this group mentality from the beginning. It seems to me that its fundamental danger, the fundamental danger is the devaluation of the sacredness of the individual as the primary category. You replace that by group identity, you have no idea what kind of devil you're messing with. Or maybe you do to some degree. You experienced it a bit because you messed about with that devil and you got tempted, and 7,000 people told you were right. It's like, imagine you're a political leader. Okay, now imagine 30 million people tell you that you're right, and they chant that in a mob, and they do that everywhere you go. That's what happened in Germany. And then you play to the crowd. You're that actor. You play to the crowd, and you get hungrier and hungrier for that validation. And you
Mm.
train yourself to say anything the crowd demands, no matter how dark.
Right.
Right. Right.